Right now, I'm just going to tell you, if unless there's a big outside event or a major stumble during the debates or during the campaign, all the indicators point to a liberal victory. But this is not a prediction. I'm sorry. I'm very
That's
sorry.
okay. No, I knew as soon as I was looking at my wording of the question, I was like, he's not going to want to give a prediction. That's not what these guys do. Hello, I'm Rachel Gilmore, your least favorite person's least favorite journalist. Welcome to Bubble Pop, a weekly show where we break down the biggest headlines so you don't have to doom scroll. Then we'll dive deeper into something juicy that you should know about. In this episode, we've got the man behind those maps that you're probably seeing everywhere. You know, those aggregations of all of the polls that our politicians probably see in their dreams and nightmares. That's right, Philippe J. Fournier, the creator of 338 Canada, is on the show. But first, the news. Tariffs are here, and it's bad. Not as bad as it could have been, but that's kind of like being forced to listen to a Nickelback album on a really long car ride. Even if it's the best album, it's still Nickelback. And these are still tariffs. There's also been drama on the campaign trail this week as several candidates' past comments have come back to haunt them, leading to several mostly conservative candidates dropping out. We're also going to take a little peek at the crumbling democracy next door because ultimately that's going to impact us too. And things are getting weird. Let's dive in. Well, looks like the entire world is once again getting to enjoy the fruit of the United States' terrible decision making. And that even includes the penguins. That's right, Trump even slapped tariffs on islands that are totally uninhabited other than by penguins. Those penguins, they've treated us very unfairly, very unjust. Those penguins, they don't have the cards. The penguins don't have the cards. Anyways, Canada could have done worse here, as I already said, but that doesn't mean this is good. Here's where things stand as I'm filming this on Thursday afternoon, because as you know, anything could change in a heartbeat here. We're all subject to Trump's whims, which is like so fun. So fun. Canada managed to avoid the 10% baseline tariffs that Trump was just throwing at everyone, but there's still a 25% tariff on vehicles going from Canada to the US and on our aluminum and steel, as well as a slightly lower tariff on our energy sector. So we are going to feel pain. And for some, they're feeling it right now. Thousands of people are out of work for 2 weeks in Windsor, where auto manufacturer Stellantis has said it plans to shut down its plant for 2 weeks starting April 7th. And they say more changes to the schedule are expected in weeks ahead. You've got to really feel for these workers who are just sitting there waiting to find out if they're losing their livelihood. That's just such an unbearable position to be in. Now, Canada isn't just taking this lying down. Prime Minister Mark Carney on Thursday laid out our plan to punch back at the US over these tariffs. He said these tariffs are unjustified, unwarranted, and misguided. And Canada will respond with a 25% tariff on imported vehicles that aren't compliant with CUSMA, our trade deal. Unlike the US tariffs, though, these tariffs won't impact auto parts, Carney said. So that way there's less impact on our seriously integrated auto sector. And the tariffs also won't impact vehicle content from Mexico. The Prime Minister also said that all of the money they make from these tariffs will go towards supporting workers. Carney also, speaking on Thursday, had some big picture warnings about where our relationship with the US is going.
Yesterday's actions by the US administration, while not specifically targeting Canada, will rupture the global economy and adversely affect global economic growth. The global economy is fundamentally different today than it was yesterday. The system of global trade anchored on the United States that Canada has relied on since the end of the Second World War, a system that, while not perfect, has helped to deliver prosperity for our country for decades, is over. Our old relationship of steadily deepening integration with the United States is over. The 80-year period when the United States embraced the mantle of global economic leadership, when it forged alliances rooted in trust and mutual respect, and championed the free and open exchange of goods and services, is over. While this is a tragedy, it is also the new reality. We must respond with both purpose and force. We are a free, sovereign, and ambitious country. We are masters in our own home.
And he also said that if the United States has walked away from its leadership role in the world, Canada will seek out other countries that share our values. And if the US doesn't want to lead, Canada will.
Canada must be looking elsewhere to expand our trade, to build our economy, and to protect our sovereignty. Canada is ready to take a leadership role in building a coalition of like-minded countries who share our values. We believe in international cooperation. We believe in the free and open exchange of goods, services, and ideas. And if the United States no longer wants to lead, Canada will.
Meanwhile, Poilievre, after laying out a plan yesterday to turn Canada into a quote-unquote economic fortress to withstand Trump's attacks, a plan that includes a whole lot of tax cuts, a business liquidity support program, and lots of focus on oil and gas development to lessen Canada's dependence on the US market, but not a lot of talk on the climate crisis and how he's going to mitigate that. Then, after the tariffs were announced, Poilievre said Thursday that if he's elected prime minister, he'd remove the GST from Canadian-made autos. That's an idea that was first put forward by the NDP, interestingly. Speaking of which, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh suggested we bring back those tax-free victory bonds that we had during both world wars to raise the money needed to fight. It's important to note that the Canadian government stopped selling these bonds years ago, in part due to the high administrative costs. But when pressed on those concerns, Singh batted them down, saying that we are in a, quote, very different context right now. Oh, and the Bloc Québécois called for greater Quebec representation in the delegation that'll be dealing with the Americans. That comes on the heels of the Trump administration listing a Quebec language law as a trade barrier, which, my God, do you know what you've done? Do you know what you've awoken? All I can say on that, les États-Unis, bonne chance. Some other big stuff happened in the election campaign this week. And while Trump's tariffs really overshadowed basically everything else, I still think it's worth mentioning. The big theme this week, again, other than tariffs, seemed to be candidates' pasts coming back to haunt them. Multiple candidates were dropped this week over unveiled old comments, all but one being from the Conservative Party. Paul Chiang, a Liberal candidate who Mark Carney initially stood behind in this controversy, which felt boneheaded given the severity of it, suggested folks should hand a Conservative over to China to collect the bounty on him. Something that, if it was a joke, was really not funny. But I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the Conservative candidate should be a little careful about what he's saying on his Twitter. But anyways, Carney accepted Chiang's resignation after the RCMP announced it was looking into his comments. Meanwhile, the Conservative Party ditched 4 candidates over a 2-day stretch, which is wild. And most of them were over past comments that these candidates had made. The most recent Conservative candidate to get the boot, Don Patel, got turfed after CTV News reported that he had done a care reaction on Facebook in response to a comment calling for Canadian residents to be deported to India so Prime Minister Modi can, quote, take care of them. And that came after, on Tuesday, the party ditched their candidate Mark McKenzie, who was running in Windsor, after CTV News obtained audio of his right-wing comedy podcast from 2022, which, that always works out well, doesn't it? Anyways, in that podcast, he apparently joked about Justin Trudeau getting the death penalty. McKenzie also voiced his support for, public hangings. So yeah, he got the boot. And then hours later, Stéphane Marquis, who was running for the Conservatives in a Montreal riding, shared that he had also gotten the axe. In a statement, he said that if you, quote, publish a non-vetted tweet on X, you can, quote, expect ostracization from your natural ally. That night, a third candidate, Laurent Singh, who was running in BC, was kicked out, but the party didn't say why, and Singh has said he plans to appeal it. So yeah, that's a pretty wild 2-day run. And honestly, if the Conservative Party actually cares now about the stuff that its candidates have said online, this could just be the beginning of the bloodletting. Because they've picked up candidates like Roman Baber, who has suggested you shouldn't trust doctors or public health officials, and Aaron Gunn, who said the gender pay gap doesn't exist. It does. I'm sure that'll also really help Poilievre with women, who were pretty upset with him this week after he made comments about their biological clocks. Although I hate the fact that I had to hear him use those words, it did lead to this very funny clapback from Jagmeet Singh.
Do you think it's appropriate for Poilievre to be invoking biological clocks and a woman's ability to get pregnant in this context?
I don't think any woman wants to hear Pierre Poilievre talking about their body, period. Period. Don't do it.
Meanwhile, the big story of not only the election campaign, but like in general in our lives is still the tariffs. And it's important to note just how bad this is, even just within the US, where Wall Street is losing its mind, Americans are terrified, rightly so, of a potential recession, and Trump is turning around and comparing it to a successful operation. Which actually kind of makes sense because getting an operation in the US can leave you financially destitute. Meanwhile, Elon Musk seems to be slightly on the outs with the Trump administration. This comes after his blatant attempts to use his wealth to get his way in Wisconsin blew up in his face. Because despite spending $20 million to try to get a pro-Trump candidate elected to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, the Liberal candidate won. And now, Trump seems to have a new, worse conspiracy peddler in his ear. Laura Loomer. This is one of those monkey's paw moments, huh? The White House fired multiple administration officials, including 3 National Security Council staffers, after a woman who once claimed 9/11 was an inside job said they were disloyal. I'm gonna leave the news there this week because I think we're all very tired. I know I am after this wild week. I've honestly been so overwhelmed and grateful for the public reaction, the huge public reaction. Oh my God, like huge to CTV dropping my fact-checking segment after there was a ton of bad faith online right-wing outrage, including from a member of Pierre Poilievre's team. It was a really hard week, but it also gave me some hope that together we can make a difference and actually make the world a little bit better. And I hope that CTV learned its lesson because I'm not going to be the last person that this happens to. This is a playbook that works. The online right wing has figured out if they kick and scream loud enough, no matter how bad faith it is, that a lot of news organizations will capitulate. But if those news organizations don't, and they actually have a backbone in the face of those attacks, we can not only protect more journalists and allow them to do the kind of reporting that kicks up those kinds of outrages, because a lot of the most important reporting does. And in the process, I actually think that protects our democracy. Not to be too dramatic, but but I'm on to better things. The incredible folks at the National Observer have picked up my fact-checking segment, and I'm going to be doing that work for them. I'll be working with Emily Barron-Kadloff, and we're going to be putting that out regularly. I'll be publishing it on my socials, so keep an eye out for it. I'm super excited. And I've said this before, but I do think it's really important to point it out that the only reason I was able to stick up for myself and speak out in the face of CTV doing all this was because you guys support my work, and that has allowed me to be independent. So even if I burn a bridge with someone like CTV, that doesn't destroy my career because you guys have given me a career without the need of those mainstream institutions. So I'm really grateful for you. And I just want you to know that I recognize that this is because of you. So yeah, thank you so much. Anyways, enough about me. After the break, we're nerding out. We've all seen those maps and graphs that go viral constantly telling us who is currently winning or losing in the polls amid the federal election campaign. Well, after the break, Philippe J. Fournier, the creator of 338 Canada, which is the thing behind most of those maps and graphs that you're seeing, is going to join me. This nerd is very excited, and I hope you are too. We'll be right back. You know those maps and graphs you see throughout the election campaign? The ones that tell you who seems to be winning, who seems to be losing, and whether your province or territory is going liberal, conservative, or even maybe NDP? Well, there is a good chance that what you're looking at is from 338 Canada, which is a statistical model of electoral projection based on historical trends, opinion polls, and demographic data. The world of political projections can seem like a nerdier version of witchcraft, depending on what you're looking at and how you interpret it. But luckily, we've got a pro here to help us make sense of it all. Philippe J. Fournier is the creator of 338 Canada, co-host of the Numbers podcast, and has written for Politico, The Walrus, and L'Actualité. And he's a regular guest on CBC News where he breaks down the polls. Philippe, welcome to Bubble Pop.
Good morning, Rachel. Good to see you.
It's great to have you on. I'm so excited. We get to nerd out today.
Let's do it.
Yeah. So, I mean, first things first, we are recording this on Wednesday morning, and obviously anything could change. Today's a really big day specifically because the tariffs are either going to come out or not. You guys, by the time you're listening to this, will know what has happened. But right now, we don't know. And so, yeah, anything could change in the polls, which is always true. But I'm wondering what the polls are telling you right now about this federal election.
So, since the campaign began, we are now at what, day 9 today or day 10? So the Liberals entered this campaign as the slight favorite, and 10 days later, they are the heavy favorite. Now, as you said, Rachel, everything can change. We saw from the past 2 months how fast numbers can change, how public opinion can turn on a dime. But now with every day that passes, it seems like all the indicators, and not just voting intentions, are pointing towards the Liberals. And now the Liberal team must wish we could, go to the ballot boxes today to end this as quickly as possible. But with 26 days to go right now, the Liberals are in front. They're in front in key areas: Quebec, Ontario, Atlantic Canada, BC as well. And the Conservatives, even though they have a good score historically, they're trading the Liberals where they need to win more seats. And so that's why right now, Mr. Carney and the Liberals are the favorite.
Yeah, they must be, as much as I think all Canadians hate what's happening with Trump right now, it is very helpful, it seems like, for the Liberals. I was hearing a lot of chatter about how the Trump talk and the response to Trump as the ballot box question seems to favor the Liberals, as opposed to when the ballot box question is about affordability. Poilievre does a bit better on that. Is that a fair assessment? Like, as long as Trump stays in the game, that seems to be something that right now, at least, is benefiting the Liberals?
It's a fair assessment, Rachel, but I wouldn't say it's a straight line from Trump attacks Canada, it's better for the Liberals. When we saw the numbers change, like really change in late January, after Monsieur Trudeau had announced his resignation, we saw the Liberals recover a little bit, but most polls still had the Conservatives far ahead. When the big change, the big momentum shift happened, was in the last week of January. Monsieur Trump had just been inaugurated, and then he began his daily attacks and daily threats on in the economy, sovereignty, the 51st state nonsense. And it was the reaction to Donald Trump that I believe changed the momentum. Trudeau and the Liberals basically said, we're not going to stand for this. This is unfair. We're going to fight back. And even though the Conservatives have changed their messaging since, their first reaction was, well, this is Trudeau's fault. He made us weak. And even though it's something that you could defend, that Trudeau made us weak, it's an argument that could be made. It really was not in sync with the mood of Canadians. And from that point on, we saw the numbers change. And obviously now we have Mr. Carney with great personal numbers that is riding a wave, riding a honeymoon. And this is where we are right now. So it's not Trump attacks Canada, better for the Liberals. It's how you react to those Trump threats.
Which is probably why all those conservative insiders are going public, begging Pierre Poilievre to pivot. And he seemed a little bit this morning in his speech to try to focus a bit more on Trump. And but he still is critiquing the current economic state, at least of Canada, in a bid to tie that to the Liberals. But I think that a lot of people just hear Canada is the worst. It sounds like a critique of Canada, even though he intends it as a critique of the Liberals. So I'm curious to see if he pivots that. But Philippe, I did want to ask you, I mean, you've obviously been doing this for a little while now, watching all these numbers. And this feels almost like a silly question because I feel like we all know the answer. But
go ahead.
Are you seeing anything weird or unusual in the numbers this election? Like, what has stood out to you as the most interesting story they tell so far as someone who watches these professionally?
Well, my friend and podcast partner Éric Grenier mentioned on our show that the Conservatives, if they stand right now at around 38% nationally, the last time they had 38% in a general election and lost, we have to go back a century. Like usually 38, 39% for the Conservatives is a winning formula. But the entire Conservative vote really, really coalesced behind Monsieur Carney and the Liberals to a point that we haven't seen in past elections. The NDP, you're asking me which numbers are the weirder. It's weird to see the Liberals back in front after seeing them trailed by 15, then 20, then 25 points in the polls. But it's seeing the NDP in single digits, and most of that support went to the Liberals. This morning, we had the new Léger poll. Of course, Léger, one of the top pollsters in the country, has the NDP national number at 7%.
Wow.
So that means that roughly 2/3 of NDP voters decided to flee, and most of them are going to the Liberals since 2021. So I would say that's the weirdest part. But again, a weird poll happens. But when you get 12 polls in a row from professional posters that know what they're doing, and we all have the same bracket, the same range for the NDP, you can put your hand in the sand, or you can believe the data and try to do something with it.
Totally. And, I find that really interesting too about the NDP. And it makes me think about how politics makes for strange bedfellows. I mean, because as you said, like the Liberal support seems to be coming in large part from the NDP and even the Bloc Québécois a little bit, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Right now, yeah.
Yeah, and overall, the Conservative numbers, as you said, are in a range that has seen them win elections before.
Yep.
So it's not necessarily that the Conservatives are doing something that wrong. It's that this whole progressive vote is coalescing, as you said, behind the Liberals. I know we aren't going to see Poilievre out there campaigning for Singh or Blanchet, but is that in a weird way something that he needs to have happen? Like,
well, okay, I'll say this. If we think a bit retroactively, if the Conservatives do lose in the election, and I'm not making a prediction, it's way too early.
For sure.
But perhaps in hindsight, the Conservative permanent campaign that they have started since Poilievre became leader, rolling ads all the time. Not most ads, but many ads in the fall were attacking Jagmeet Singh and the NDP. And now maybe they're starting to regret it because they tore down Jagmeet Singh and the NDP so much that instead of being at 16 to 20%, which has been the NDP's average over the past 5 years, well, maybe 50 years even, now we have them in single digits, and voters who are left-leaning are ready to give that boring banker a shot, which is completely strange for me. But this, for conservatives who say we don't understand why those NDP voters are flocking to the Liberals, well, some introspection after the election could help, because they attacked and fired their advertising attacks on all sides, and it could be biting them in the behind right now.
Yeah, I mean, I said this on my podcast Campaign Cops with my friend Paris Marks, but you have to wonder if it seemed like Poilievre's intent with tying the NDP to the Liberals so strongly, the NDP Liberal coalition, was to paint the Trudeau government as extremely left. But I think that it also had the effect of painting Jagmeet Singh's NDP as not as left-wing as maybe some progressives would want, which in the analysis or calculus of the election, maybe a lot of NDP voters have internalized that and say, well, if he's not that progressive anyways, might as well go for the other guy. I don't know. It's a lot to think about, but we don't know that, right? We can't read minds.
It's part of the thinking that will have to occur after the election. Yeah. I would say, however, that before Christmas, let's say, it would have been very difficult to criticize the campaign of the Conservatives on a purely strategic point of view. Whatever they were doing was working. They were leading by 25 points. And even though sometimes Pierre Poilievre and his team did or said something that go like, okay, that's a bit strange, I'm looking at the numbers like, well, clearly it's working. But right now, the ballot question, the campaign, completely changed in January. And it seems that they were not ready for this. And Monsieur Carney right now, as I said, he's benefiting from his honeymoon.
Yeah. And, Philippe, I did want to ask you some questions about polls more broadly as well. Okay. Maybe some of this is me being a big nerd or getting a little too in the weeds. So I'm sorry to the listeners if you aren't quite as nerdy as I am. But one thing that I think about a lot, and forgive my ignorance on this as well, is about online polls
Yeah,
because they can't be assigned a margin of error, right?
that's
Which
right.
my understanding of that is that that makes it effectively impossible to know how confident you can be in it. But I wanted to ask you about that. Like, should we dismiss online polls
No,
entirely? Like, how do we
no.
interpret them?
Okay, so we have to be careful. Okay, we're gonna get in very nerdy here.
Yeah,
Okay, but
sorry everyone, but
the term margin of error in
mm,
statistics is something very precise. It's
mm,
an equation that you can use to calculate the uncertainty of a sample. Now, uncertainty and margin of error is not the same thing. If you have a poll whose respondents are not picked randomly, like in an online poll, then the margin of error is not applicable. It's not that the poll doesn't have uncertainty, it's that the classic definition of margin of error does not apply. Now, okay, so I hope I didn't lose half your audience after
no,
this
it's fine.
comment,
You did that very
but
well. It's very
but
succinct.
but online polls, they're pulled from a panel. So for the example of Léger has a vast panel of Canadians. They send out emails and they try to construct a sample that is representative of the population. So it's not picked at random, even though there's some randomness. Not the whole panel, of course, is polled every time. And so they try to build a representative sample of the population using the data from the census to have enough young people, old people, people in every region, people of both genders. And so they build a sample. And so it's not that it doesn't have uncertainty, it's that we don't really know what it is. We have a guideline by using still the old classic formula that says if it was a random sample, it would have an uncertainty of plus or minus 319 times out of 20 or something. And it gives you a guideline. But if people are confused by that, and I understand why, then you look at the track record. If the sample, example again from Léger, if it's an online panel that I think it's 400,000 Canadians, if that panel is not representative, it will falter when we compare the final polls with the election results. And in the past decade, federally, these online polls have been very good. And so
Okay.
it's not that we don't doubt them. I always doubt. I'm a scientist. It's
Yeah.
part of what we do to doubt. But when you see that it works, and not once but repeatedly, you go like, okay, they know what they're doing. And so it goes from the big online polls, the Ipsos, Abacus data, and others. Everybody can be right once, but if you're right or close enough repeatedly, you have to give them a little credit.
That is incredibly helpful, actually, because
All
I
right.
think that a lot of the things that people think about when they see polls is how to interpret them and how to engage with the information they are seeing, right? And that's why I also wanted to ask you, I mean, what are the biggest mistakes that you see people make, even when they're interpreting your interpretation of the polls? Like, what are the biggest assumptions that people get wrong when they are talking about polls in an election campaign?
Oh, well, one would be very personal. I
Yeah.
know I know a lot of people go to my website, take a screenshot, and then publish it online and say, "See that poll from 338." And I have to remind them very kindly, I have little boxes that explain this is not a poll.
Yeah.
It's a projection based on polls mostly. So there's modelization in there using demographic data and historical patterns. So it's not a poll, but it gives you a rough idea. All natural sciences, like physics, biology, chemistry, all of them, all they do is give increasingly accurate approximations of everything. So the mass of the electron, we know to the 10th digits. Well, what is the 12 digits? We don't know, but we want to find out. I'm a physicist, so I'm taking this
Yeah.
example. So everything we do in the natural science is to have an approximation of the real world, and then we refine it to have it, so it can get better every generation. Now, this is not as much a natural science because you're dealing with something far more complicated than electrons or galaxies. You're dealing with human beings. And human beings are complex. Sometimes they lie, sometimes they confuse, sometimes they change their minds, they're moody, they're in a bad mood, they're happy. And so pollsters have to deal with that. So there's a bit of art add to the science. But a poll is an approximation of the landscape. And so that's why if you take all of these polls, they're all little pieces of the big puzzle that you try to assemble. And for the people who want perfection, you can't have perfection. You won't get it. If you want the projections to be good enough, that's what it is. And so I hope I'm guiding better information to the landscape, to voters, even though some people will have very selective memories. And if I may give you an example, Rachel.
Yeah, for sure.
In the Alberta election, I remember in 2019, Jason Kenney, my projection was almost perfect. It's good work and also got a little lucky. Okay, that's how it works. So I called the winner in 82 of 87 ridings, and many of them were right on. So I was very happy about that. But I cannot tell you how many emails I got from people living in those 5 ridings that I missed, saying, you don't know anything, you're a fraud, you missed my riding, you said this party would win and the other. And I keep telling them, you have to look at the big picture. If I'm right 94% of the time, yeah, okay, so we don't report planes that land correctly, we just report on planes crashing. So it's selective memory, and it's okay, we have to live with that.
Yeah. And, I think that leads well into the other thing I wanted to ask you, which is, what do you find to be the most useful takeaway from polls? Where do you think that people seeing these conversations can get the most out of them?
Well, that's a tough one.
I guess it kind of depends on the person, right? Whether they're
it depends on the person.
Or...
Well, I focus on politics, and
Yeah.
I've been told by some observers that I deal too much with voting intentions. To which I reply, if you go to a baker, you won't say, "Why is there so much bread around here?"
Yeah.
And so this is what I do. But voting intentions is only one indicator. There's more. Pollsters regularly ask, do you think the country is going into the right direction? Do you approve of the government? Do you approve of this party leader or that party leader? And so in these additions of numbers, we can find clues. In the 2021 election, federal election, if memory serves, it started at mid-August. And so the reason Trudeau and the Liberals went into an early election is because the numbers were favoring them. They were heading towards a majority. And in the first 2 weeks of the campaign, we saw not the Conservatives, but Erin O'Toole, the Conservative leader back then, his personal numbers improved. It's like the country was softening up to Erin O'Toole, and then days later, we saw the Conservatives surge back into a tie with the Liberals. So the favorables of the leader was an early indicator of a possible Conservative comeback. And it happened. So this is what we're watching. Voting intentions, of course, is top of mind. It's not the only indicator, and we try to get clues from the mood of voters. It's not always easy. It's not always perfect, but it's good enough.
So basically, if you want to be a really big politics nerd, there's a lot more you can look into than just voting intention.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
One thing that I always wonder about as well is, and I think that it obviously is case by case, but do you find that, it feels like there's a new scandal every few days in elections and stuff. Do they really generally impact polls, or is it just journalists looking for a story of the day? I guess, does it usually just come down to a basic ballot box question, or do you see a lot of fluctuation based on scandals historically?
I'm glad you asked this question, Rachel. I think we should not confuse a scandal with the outrage industrial complex that we see online every day.
I agree.
So this is, I think, what my readers, and to a lesser extent, my students. I'm still teaching in college physics in Montreal, and many of my students are aware of what I'm doing, and so I say to them, we follow the scientific method, we are trying to be rigorous, and we don't put our personal inputs in there. So the daily media rounds of, as you said, scandals, very little of it resonates with voters. Unless it becomes a pattern. You may have seen or heard Monsieur Carney. He misplaced the name of his candidate in Montreal, the survivor of
Yes.
the Polytechnique shooting, right? And so it was a mistake, and it could have resonated more, but he apologized, and it was quickly forgotten because it didn't become a pattern. If he were to do that every day, the comparison with old Joe Biden would come very fast. But so I've seen people call this a scandal, and I says, well, so far the Liberals are leading by 20% in Quebec, so I guess they don't care. So we have to listen to voters more than opinion makers, I would say. And this is what polls do. This is what scientific professional polling does. Is it goes beyond the headlines and it asks voters what they care about. And right now, the ballot box question, yes, affordability is still high, but dealing with the Americans is just as high. And now you cannot divorce the cost of living with dealing with the Americans. Because, yeah, if the economy is hurt in Canada, if the auto industry suffers in Ontario, I live in Quebec, the aluminum industry is big here. If
Yeah.
those industries go down because of the tariffs and because of tough relations with the US, yeah, cost of living is going to go high, and it's going to be a problem. So yeah, the polls give you the score of the game and give you a better sense of what's really happening than anything else you can see.
Definitely. And that always makes me wonder too, and I think that's one thing that's so interesting about what you do with 338 Canada is polls, there are things that polls specifically on their own can't account for, right? That could influence the final outcome or at least struggle to maybe take into account. Like you said, humans are complicated, more complicated
Yep.
than galaxies. So I
Oh
guess
yeah.
I did want to ask you, like, what are the things that polls struggle to account for that can really change that final electoral outcome?
Hmm. I'm not sure what to say here. So what do polls struggle? I mean, there's one thing. I mean, voter enthusiasm matters
Mhm.
in an election, and I think polls not all don't always capture it, but also voter enthusiasm can be an illusion. So the fact that we see, for instance, the rallies that Pierre Poilievre is holding,
Yeah.
these are big crowds. It's not nothing. It shows you how committed thousands of conservative voters are in these areas. And so I am not discounting this proper, like at first hand, right?
Of course.
It matters. It's just that then you look at the polling and you see, okay, Pierre Poilievre draws big crowds, but it's those who go into a rainy night into a hangar to cheer their favorite leader. This is not the median voter. This is the very committed voters,
Yeah.
and we know from past elections and from polls that in general, conservative voters are far more committed and faithful to their party than for the NDP and the Liberals and even the Bloc. So, again, I don't discount this. It is impressive what Pierre Poilievre is doing in those rallies. It's just that I'm not gonna look at the polls, look at the rally, and says, well, clearly the polls are wrong.
Yeah.
The polls are telling the story of the average or median voter, and those rallies don't. So we'll see. But I receive a lot of criticism online about look at these rallies. It's like, yeah, okay, great,
Yeah.
but that's not what I do. I don't compile rallies. I can compile the polls. So
Yeah. And you also weave in the historic and demographic data and stuff too, right? Which is interesting.
yeah, I mean, it's a fine tuning thing. It doesn't change a whole lot.
Mm.
The polls still drive most of the movement we see in the projections, but there are case to case basis. So sometimes a party, and I give the example on my website, Québec Solidaire, the left wing party in Quebec,
Yeah.
in the election in 2014, they had 7% of the vote, and in one riding that they won, they had 50%. Next election, they went to 15% of the vote. If you go by a swing model, that means the Quebec Solidaire was going to get 100% of the vote in that riding. Obviously, that was not going to happen.
Yeah.
And so it was helpful to look at the demographic of that riding to see who is the QS voter, the age bracket, the gender, and everything. And so this helps, but it is really fine tuning. So I try not to give too much weight to this fine tuning because the polls usually tell the story. And for those who don't believe me, I'm not always right, but the record of my website is pretty good. It's nine times out of 10, I have the right winner for writing. So it's good. It's not perfect, but it's good.
The recipe works. And maybe there's a bit of a flaw in the premise of my question there, right? Maybe a properly worded poll can maybe account for most things that could impact a final outcome.
But it's also the fact that polls, we have provincial polls and national polls, and very rarely we have a local polls. And I try to interpret this provincial data into what's happening at the writing level.
Yeah.
That's why when you look at a specific writing on 338, you see the uncertainty plus or minus 8% or plus or minus 7%.
Yeah.
It's a bell curve. It's a huge bell curve. And it's not a bug. It's a feature. If the results are uncertain, it would be taking voters for idiots to say, oh no, I know. In that riding in Eglinton, the Liberals are going to get 38. No, I say they're going to get between, I don't know, I'm making up numbers here, but 32 and 42, let's say.
Yeah.
You have to give them a range of outcome. And I know this is extremely nerdy, but this is how, that's how we deal with statistics and science. It's there's much uncertainty in there.
100%, which is why I'm looking at the last question I had for you, and I'm like, he's not going to answer this because he's not going to want to.
Try me.
Well, I wanted to ask, is there anything you feel comfortable predicting? And that's the word I feel like pollsters maybe hate is because right now you deal with the here and now based on the numbers, right? And that you don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. But I am curious about whether there's anything that based on what you've seen historically, you feel even a little bit comfortable predicting about what might happen. And everyone give Philippe grace if he gets this wrong, okay? Because I'm asking him to do something they don't normally do.
I'm going to tell you this, Rachel. The answer is I'm not comfortable at all.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's actually a good endorsement of your work.
Because if you look at the numbers, let's say in Quebec, okay? This morning, so the Liberals are in the low 40s. Bloc Québécois around 22 or 23%. This is very close to the results in Quebec in the 2011 federal election. Gilles Duceppe and the Bloc had 23% and won 4 seats. They were wiped off the map by Jack Layton. So we're seeing similar numbers right now, but substitute Layton for Carney and the Liberals. I would not be comfortable saying, oh yeah, the Bloc is going to win a handful of seats. But it's within the realm of possibilities. So right now, I'm just going to tell you, unless there's a big outside event or a major stumble during the debates or during the campaign, all the indicators point to a Liberal victory. But this is not a prediction. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry.
That's okay. No, I knew as soon as I was looking at my wording of the question, I was like, he's not going to want to give a prediction. That's not what these guys do. Well, Philippe, I think that's basically all the questions I had for you. But is there anything that you think people should know? And I will also ask you to pump your socials in a second. But just before we get to that, is there anything that you think people need to know about polls or about this election that I didn't ask you?
Don't forget that polls that do not say the same things, polls that show variance or divergence during a campaign, that's entirely normal. It's normal to have a spectrum of results. That's why I'm here. That's why I make a weighted average of it. It's not that some polls are wrong and others are right. It's that we throw darts at a moving target. And so don't give pollsters a hard time because they're different. If they all said the same thing, I would be far more worried about the state of polling in the horse race right now. So give pollsters a break. What they're doing is fantastic. I repeat, I'm not a pollster. I'm a polls analyst. I need these guys to do well. I cheer for them to do well, regardless of which party they put ahead. It's not that hard for me to not be partisan. I try to, again, be analytical and go with the numbers, and it's worked so far. So that's what I'll say.
So be friendly to your local neighborhood pollster and your local neighborhood poll analyst. Philippe, thank you so much. Where can people keep up with you and find your work?
On Blue Sky, you can find me at 338 Canada. On Facebook, banned my page because apparently I'm news, so you cannot access my Facebook page. Yeah, well, I guess. You can go to my newsletter, 338canada.ca, and the main website is 338canada.com. And so go there and take screenshots and criticize me, but do it politely, please.
Be nice to each other, okay? All right, Philippe, thank you so much for your time. This was a really great conversation, and I appreciate you hopping on Bubble Pop.
Thank you, Rachel, for having me. Much appreciated.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Bubble Pop. I'm Rachel Gilmore, your least favorite person's least favorite journalist. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing to Bubble Pop on YouTube, Patreon, Substack, and wherever you like to listen. You can also find me on basically any socials. I'm on Blue Sky, I'm on TikTok, I'm on Instagram. Look around, I'm probably there. I'd like to say a special thank you to Hans Vivian Wenzel, who is the man behind the incredibly groovy music for Bubble Pop. You can find more of his stuff on Spotify under the artist name Hans, lowercase h with an exclamation mark. Thanks again for hanging out with me. This week more than ever, I want to thank you because doing this is a dream. And not only that, but I can defend myself and my work because of you. I couldn't do any of this without you. So thank you, and I'll see you next time.